Hey, my name's Paul. I am the education coordinator at Film Streams in Omaha, Nebraska. Let's talk about film. This video is about how animated films use art to support their narratives and educate viewers about things like culture and art itself. My goal here is going to be pretty simple. I just want to look at some cool animated films and talk about various artistic styles and how those help create meaning or understanding to the overall narrative of the film. I hope that sounds cool with you because it's too late to change it now. This video is for art students or art nerds or people who just like film and want to learn about art. I chose to organize this video into two categories: films with animation styles that add meaning or understanding to art, and films with animation styles that add meaning or understanding to culture. But are culture and art that different? Isn't culture art? And isn't art a part of culture? Okay, yes, I understand that these categories might be interchangeable to some degree, and to be totally honest with you, I think any of the films that I chose can fit into either category pretty easily. But I had to figure out some way to organize this video, so this is what we got and we're sticking with it. Some of the films I chose to watch have animation styles that are pretty synonymous with art movements or techniques or artists themselves. These animation styles not only inform viewers about art, but they also inform or add meaning to the film's overall narrative. Loving Vincent is a unique artistic accomplishment that claims to be the very first fully painted feature film. This film is about the final days of the life of art superstar Vincent van Gogh. Loving Vincent is sort of like a post-impressionist whodunit. This film skews historical accuracy to pose a question, or a mystery rather, surrounding Vincent van Gogh's death. Did he really die by his own hand, or is there more to the story here? The animation style of Loving Vincent is straight up post-impressionist. This film uses Van Gogh's own style to tell a fictionalized story of Van Gogh's life. It's pretty cool, right? In order to create this film, the filmmakers first shot live action scenes with actors, and then an army of artists came in and painted each frame in Van Gogh's post-impressionist hand.
I feel absolutely calm and in a normal state. This is what he writes me 6 weeks before he's dead. How does a man go from being absolutely calm to being suicidal in 6 weeks?
It's sad. I get that. But what good would delivering that letter do now?
Post-impressionism developed in the late 1800s, and as a style, it's kind of hard to uniquely define. But what we can say about this style is that subjectivity and perception of the artist is really important. Emotion rather than realism is stressed. The use of color can be vivid or unexpected, and painters' brushstrokes are oftentimes bold and communicative. Let's talk about how Loving Vincent's animation style adds to understanding of Vincent van Gogh's art and post-impressionism as a movement. I think the narrative of Loving Vincent pairs extremely well with some of the defining characteristics of post-impressionism. This can help the viewer understand the film and the art movement better. We've already talked about how the film doesn't follow the exact historical record when it comes to the end of Van Gogh's life, but the film and post-impressionism tend to throw realism out the window, and they do that in order to focus on things like emotion or experience. Like Van Gogh and other post-impressionists, the narrative of Loving Vincent can feel a little bit choppy at some points. The film's main character, Armand, is really just a stand-in. He's there to ask people around Van Gogh what he was like during his final days. He sort of jumps around the town, interviewing people about their relationship with Van Gogh, their experiences, their perceptions, their opinions about the artist. Color was a huge part of this film. Remember, this film was created by putting a bunch of paintings together to create this animation style, and as you're watching the film, I think you can totally see that. There's a bunch of really rich, beautiful tones that don't really exist outside of the imagination of art, And along with those tones, there's a bunch of really brilliant moments of intense contrast. And I think that contrast is very post-impressionist. When it comes to understanding art and animation styles, the thing that I think is most successful with Loving Vincent is that the film is not only animated as post-impressionist, but the narrative itself feels like a post-impressionist tale. The defining characteristics of the art movement also can be seen within the narrative itself, and I think that is pretty cool. If you haven't seen it, you should totally check it out. Let me first say that I'm not the hugest fan of superhero films. I think they're cool, and I think that I understand what people get from them, but they've never been my favorite cinematic experience. But let me also say that Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is brilliant, amazing, wonderful, everything you could ever want. The narrative and mythology of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse feels really cool and fresh. Miles Morales is a teen who is bitten by a radioactive spider and then slowly becomes Spider-Man. Now that sounds like every Spider-Man film you've ever watched, right? However, in this film, there's this kind of like science thing that goes wrong and causes multiple realities or dimensions to converge. And the film is gifted with not only one, but multiple versions of Spider-Man, including a Spider-Woman. Now, Spider-Man as a character is not new. This superhero has been slinging webs in comics since the 1960s. But what is new is this film's brilliant, amazing, wonderful use of animation to pay homage to the very long legacy of comic book art, pop art, and animation. Right away, I think you're gonna notice that this film looks a little bit different than how you might expect an animated film to look today. One of the first things that I noticed was that parts of the film are out of focus. And actually, while I was watching it, I tried to refresh my page a few times, thinking that there was an issue with the website. And then I looked it up and learned that the blurriness was intentional. This blurriness is a direct reference to comic book art. When the comics were printed, sometimes the colors would misprint or overlap each other, and the lines would create this kind of blurry effect. And that's what Spider-Verse is trying to recreate, which I think is totally genius. In this film, we see even more inspiration from comics by the use of shading techniques that the animators use. If you look closely, you'll notice stippling and hatching, which is used to create value and depth. And this is a classic comic book technique. While I was watching Spider-Verse, I couldn't help but think about Roy Lichtenstein and other famous pop artists. Pop art was a movement that began in the 1950s and saw its peak in the 1960s. This style of art was meant to be a response to the elitist art world at that time. Sources of inspiration for pop art were things like Hollywood films, stardom, product packages, and comic books. Pop art is typically made for wide consumption. It's mass-produced. It's usually aimed at a younger audience. Pop art can be witty or irreverent, and a lot of critics at that time saw pop art as something of low value due to its subject matter, which, you know, to me is pretty cool. Akira is an animated film from Japan that helped pave the way for anime in the West. Akira is about the shady governmental doings in Neo-Tokyo in 2019. Which at the time the film was created was the future. Kaneda, the leader of a motorcycle gang, is attempting to save his friend from the clutches of a government experiment that's gone wrong. The animation style of Akira is known as anime, and you may already be a fan of this style. Anime is much more common in the West today, and we have films like Akira and Studio Ghibli films to thank for that. Akira was created using a process called celluloid animation. This process uses transparent sheets of plastic and hand-drawn images to create animation. The trick is to layer the sheets on top of each other and then change a few of the layers to create movements. In a typical animated film, there are 24 frames per second, or 24 sheets of celluloid per second. This process can be a huge investment of both time, money, resources, but it totally pays off. I do want to draw attention to Japanese animation, or anime, and animation that is more typical in the United States. The plots and the narratives are a huge difference between anime and Western animation. Plots in anime can be super complex, like we see in Akira. Anime is not only meant for children or younger people, like we tend to think of animation in the West. There are plenty of anime that is specifically made for a mature or an older audience. The characters in anime themselves can also be just as complex as the plots. Exaggerated features are pretty typical across all animation. In Western animation, this exaggeration can happen to the character's entire body, while in anime, we usually see a more realistic body with slighter exaggerations, usually in the face or the eyes. There's also a geographical component too, right? Some people think that animation that is made in the East or in Japan is anime, and animation made in the West or other places is not. Now we're going to talk about how animation style can add meaning or understanding to culture. Put simply, how can animation teach us about culture? Specifically, cultures that might not be our own or might have less representation than others. The Tale of Princess Kaguya is a Studio Ghibli film, and it's also the last film directed by Isao Takahata before his death. The Tale of Princess Kaguya follows Princess Kaguya, who is a heavenly being born from a bamboo tree. The film begins with her infancy and spins its narrative into her young adulthood. Kaguya goes from a simple beginning as the daughter of a bamboo cutter to a sought-after noble princess known for her beauty. In the film, Kaguya has to learn how to become a princess, and she's instructed on the finer points of Japanese culture. We see things like a Japanese naming ceremony, the contemplative practice of Japanese calligraphy, or shodo, koto, which is a Japanese instrument, and Japanese scroll art. We even get glimpses of things like the historical ideas of Japanese beauty or fashion. The animation style itself is pretty special. If you've seen a Studio Ghibli film before, The Tale of Princess Kaguya stands out a bit from the crowd. The film is animated with rugged charcoal-like strokes and soft, unsaturated watercolors. It's a really approachable kind of animation. Combining the animation style with the fact that nature is a huge theme throughout the film, we might understand that simplicity of life is being discussed within the narrative. The animation style is almost synonymous with things like Japanese woodblock prints and scroll art.
Oh my, it's beautiful.
The incorporation of Japanese culture in a Studio Ghibli film is super common. We can learn a lot from Studio Ghibli films about Japan and their culture, religious traditions, history. But in The Tale of Princess Kaguya, the animation style uses historical artistry to entrench viewers in classic Japanese culture. Plus, it's just a super great film. Kirikou and the Sorceress follows a young hero named Kirikou as he tries to save his village from an evil witch. This film is set in pre-colonial West Africa. Ousselou was inspired by a West African folktale and took creative freedom to create this film and other films in the Kirikou series. Kirikou and the Sorceress feels like a homage to oral traditions and West African storytelling. Things like repetition, the characters Kirikou encounters, themes of corruption or greed all support this film's Africanity. However, we should note that Ousselou is a white French filmmaker, and there's some historical unpacking that we have to do here. France has a history of colonial rule over countries in West Africa, so a natural concern should be, why should a white French filmmaker get to tell a West African-inspired, West African-set, West African-centric film? That's a question that I'll leave with you to think about. The animation style of Kirikou and the Sorceress is very much like silhouette animation, which has a rich history in animated films. Silhouette animation is created by backlighting cutouts and creating shadows to create the animation process. This form of animation can be created without a lot of technology like computer programs or intense editing. The artistic result is somewhat flat looking but also very visually striking. Because the animation process is 2D, silhouette animation creates profiles and front-facing shots of characters. Kirikou and the Sorceress isn't strictly silhouette animation, but it's a clear inspiration. What does this source of animation offer us? How does it add to our understanding of culture, specifically pre-colonial West African culture? Silhouette animation can look a little simplistic, especially in comparison to the mega productions that we see coming out of studios that have mastered computer animation. But I think in the case of Kirikou and the Sorceress, this 2D kind of effect really lets the characters and the settings and the tale shine. All of these things are also very African-centric. Persepolis follows a young Marjan as her country and life begin to drastically change due to the Iranian Revolution. This revolution was a series of events in the late 1970s that took power away from imperial rule and gave power to an Islamic Republic in Iran. If we're trying to look at how animation gives understanding to culture, Persepolis is a gold mine. This film was originally Marjan Satrapi's autobiographical graphic memoir, so the film's animation style is pretty reminiscent of a comic or a graphic novel. There's not much color, a lot of contrasting value. Everything is either really dark or white. There's minimal shading. This animation style isn't overly simplified, but it's not entirely based on realism either. What I wanted to talk about was that this film was created after Iran moved to an Islamic Republic. As we see in the film, there is a shift in norms and expectations that takes place within Marjan's life. Some she struggles with and pushes against. I think here is where animation can really help teach us about culture. We see things in this film like Marjan removing her headscarf in public, parties with illegal alcohol, the sale of banned music. In Tehran at that time, all of these things would be illegal. However, since the film is animated, the film can be set in Tehran without putting the actors in danger of being arrested or fined. My point here is that animation can really allow certain things to happen, things that might be inaccessible or even dangerous in real life. And we see this in Persepolis, as a young woman struggles with the idea of authority in her society. And I think it's important that we show this. I think it's important that Marjan's experience is shown because it's real. And the fact that it's in an animated film doesn't make it any less real. Persepolis is an authentic look at a young woman's experience with a shifting cultural landscape as she tries to make her way in the world. And it just also happens to be an animated film. I don't know, art is cool. Do I really need to say anything else besides that? What? Should probably say something else besides that, okay. Animation can be both aesthetically pleasing and it can also inform viewers and create meaning. That meaning can help viewers understand or appreciate the narrative of films better. So don't ignore the animation styles of films because it means something. And remember, film itself is art. So an animated film is kind of like double art, which is a lot of art. Is that better? Nobody's really there. So. Bye.